There is something I have watched happen over and over again during my 109 years, and it still breaks my heart. People spend thousands of dollars chasing the newest miracle diet while forgetting the simple meals that quietly kept generations of families healthy. I have seen neighbors worry themselves sick over complicated health advice, only to overlook the food already sitting in their own kitchens. I often wondered why so many people believed that the answer had to be expensive, when the strongest lessons I ever learned came from an old wooden table, a cast iron pot, and the hands of people who never called themselves experts. Before this conversation is over, I want to share something that changed the way I think about growing older. And I hope you stay with me because the most important part has very little to do with food at all. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I have lived all my life in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I have cooked in the same little kitchen for decades, feeding my husband while he was alive, raising my children, spoiling my grandchildren, and welcoming neighbors whenever they needed a warm meal or simply someone to sit beside. Looking back now, I cannot remember a single fashionable diet that lasted very long, but I can still remember the smell of fresh vegetable soup filling the house after a hard day on our family farm. I still remember the sound of laughter around the dinner table on cold evenings when simple food somehow made tired people feel rich. Throughout my life, I noticed that many older people who stayed active the longest rarely spoke about superfoods or miracle ingredients. They spoke about routines, patience, and preparing meals with care. They did not rush through life, and they certainly did not rush through dinner. As the years passed, I met people from different parts of America and even visitors from other countries who stopped in Lancaster. Their recipes were different, their accents were different, yet one surprising idea kept returning. The healthiest older people almost always trusted ordinary ingredients more than expensive promises. That thought stayed with me for many years, but it was not until one unforgettable winter that I finally understood why four humble dishes had quietly become the foundation of my entire life. And once I understood that, another lesson appeared that surprised me even more, because it had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with the human heart. I did not arrive at those thoughts all at once. They grew slowly, season after season, the way tomatoes ripen in a garden when nobody is standing over them with a clock. I remember one autumn many years ago, after several long days working on our family farm, when my husband came into the kitchen looking completely worn out. His shoulders were stiff, his boots were covered in mud, and he smiled only because he knew supper would be waiting. I reached for the vegetables we had picked that very morning, a few onions, carrots, celery, fresh herbs, and a handful of beans I had cooked the night before. There was nothing fancy about that meal, yet every time I placed that warm bowl on the table, I noticed something that puzzled me. We did not simply eat. We slowed down. We talked. We laughed about little things that had happened during the day. Somehow, by the time the bowls were empty, the tiredness no longer seemed quite as heavy. For years, I wondered whether it was the food itself or the peaceful moments surrounding it that stayed with people the longest. As time passed, I began paying closer attention to older neighbors who seemed to carry their age with quiet grace. One of them, Mr. Harrison, lived only a few streets away. He never cared about trendy diets, and he often joked that advertisements changed faster than the seasons. Whenever I visited him, I found simple homemade meals simmering gently on the stove, instead of expensive products filling the cupboards. He once smiled and told me, "Evelyn, a kitchen should calm your heart before it fills your stomach." I never forgot those words. Years later, I met my dear friend Margaret Hughes from Asheville, North Carolina, after we had spent decades apart. We talked for hours about our families, our gardens, and the people we had watched grow old. Although we had lived very different lives, one surprising truth appeared again. The people we both admired most were rarely the ones chasing every new health trend. They prepared ordinary meals with care, shared them with people they loved, and never rushed the moments around the table. That conversation stayed with me all the way back to Lancaster, and it made me look differently at four recipes I had cooked almost without thinking for most of my life. I did not realize then that each of those humble dishes carried a lesson far greater than the ingredients themselves, and the very first one became our family's greatest comfort after the hardest days on the farm. The first recipe became part of our family almost without anyone noticing. After long days in the fields, when the wind seemed to carry every bit of strength out of our bodies, I always reached for the same ingredients. I filled my old soup pot with onions, carrots, celery, tomatoes, green beans, cabbage when it was in season, and whatever fresh herbs the garden had generously offered that morning. Sometimes I added a handful of lentils or beans to make the meal a little heartier, and I let everything simmer slowly, while the kitchen filled with the kind of aroma that made everyone drift toward the table before I even called them. People often ask me why I made that soup so many times over the decades. The truth is that I never thought of it as a recipe for a long life. I simply noticed that meals made from simple vegetables left us feeling comfortably satisfied without making us feel heavy. Many people today believe every healthy meal has to include expensive ingredients or complicated instructions. But throughout my life, I noticed that the people who remained active well into their later years often trusted ordinary seasonal foods they could recognize and prepare with their own hands. Researchers continue studying how vegetables, beans, herbs, and fiber rich foods may help support healthy aging, yet my confidence never came from reading scientific papers. It came from watching generations gather around the same table, year after year, sharing the same humble meal while enjoying each other's company. I still remember one rainy evening when my youngest grandson quietly asked why my soup always tasted different from anyone else's. I smiled because the answer surprised even me. It was never about a secret ingredient. Every pot changed a little depending on what the garden gave us that week. Some days there were sweet tomatoes, other days extra carrots, and sometimes fresh parsley seemed to brighten the entire kitchen. That taught me something important. Nature rarely repeats itself exactly, and perhaps our meals should not either. Looking back, I believe that flexibility kept cooking joyful instead of becoming another set of strict rules. Yet, as comforting as that soup was, another family tradition arrived every winter that carried an even deeper meaning. It became the meal everyone requested when snow covered Lancaster, and the story behind it changed the way I understood kindness, family, and the quiet power of sharing food with people who needed hope almost as much as they needed supper. When people ask me what changed the most during my lifetime, many expect me to talk about technology or medicine. Those things certainly changed, but I think something else changed even faster. We slowly began believing that healthy eating had to become confusing. Somewhere along the way, many kitchens filled with products that promised quick answers, while family recipes quietly disappeared into old boxes and faded notebooks. I am not saying every modern idea is wrong. Researchers continue studying many new approaches, and some studies suggest that different eating patterns may help support healthy aging for certain people. But throughout my life, I noticed that chasing every new trend often left people feeling frustrated instead of peaceful. One winter, I watched a dear neighbor spend a small fortune trying one fashionable diet after another. Every few weeks, there was another book, another list of forbidden foods, another expensive package arriving at the front door. She became so worried about eating perfectly that she hardly enjoyed meals anymore. Then, one snowy afternoon, she came to my house, exhausted and discouraged. I served her the simple chicken and vegetable stew that had warmed my family through countless Pennsylvania winters. It was made with chicken, onions, carrots, celery, potatoes, fresh parsley, and homemade broth that had been gently simmering for hours. We sat together without rushing, and before long she smiled for the first time in weeks. She looked at me and quietly said, "Evelyn, I forgot that eating can feel comforting instead of stressful." I have carried those words with me ever since. Many older people believe that constant worry can steal joy from the table faster than almost anything else. That does not mean we should ignore our health. It simply reminds me that caring for ourselves should not become another source of fear. Looking back, I also realized another mistake many of us made. We started eating in a hurry. We stood by the kitchen counter, watched television while chewing, or hurried through dinner as if every meal were another task to finish. Yet the people I admired most always treated meals as quiet moments to reconnect with family, neighbors, and themselves. They ate slowly, talked kindly, and appreciated simple food without guilt. At first, I believed those habits were merely pleasant traditions. But then another experience changed my thinking completely. It involved a Sunday breakfast that brought 4 generations around one table. And what happened during those mornings taught me a lesson that no cookbook could ever explain. Those Sunday mornings became the heartbeat of our family long before I realized how precious they were. Every week, no matter how busy life had been, someone would find an excuse to gather in my kitchen. My children brought their little ones. Neighbors sometimes stopped by without an invitation. And before long, the house was filled with voices, laughter, and the familiar sound of my old skillet warming on the stove. The breakfast everyone waited for was surprisingly simple. I whisked fresh eggs with a handful of chopped spinach, folded in sweet onions that had softened slowly in a little olive oil, and served everything besides slices of toasted whole grain bread with fresh tomatoes from the garden whenever the season allowed. Sometimes there was a bowl of fresh berries or sliced apples in the middle of the table because I believed every colorful plate invited people to slow down and enjoy what nature had provided. Looking back, I think the meal itself mattered, but what mattered even more was the feeling it created. Nobody hurried away. Nobody stared at a telephone. We looked into each other's eyes, shared stories from the week, and listened with patience. Throughout my life, I noticed that many older people who remained cheerful and active seemed to protect these quiet moments just as carefully as they protected their gardens. Years later, after my grandchildren became adults with families of their own, they confessed something that touched my heart. They remembered the conversations around the breakfast table far more clearly than the recipes. One granddaughter told me she still cooks eggs with spinach whenever life feels overwhelming, because the smell reminds her that everything will eventually be all right. That simple sentence stayed with me for days. It made me wonder whether the greatest nourishment sometimes comes from the memories we create while sharing food, rather than from the food alone. Researchers continue studying the connections between social relationships, emotional well-being, and healthy aging, and many older people believe that feeling connected may help support a healthier life. I cannot explain it like a scientist, but I have watched lonely people lose their spark much faster than those who felt surrounded by kindness. Still, there was one meal that revealed this lesson more clearly than any family breakfast ever could. It was the meal I prepared for neighbors who were ill, widowed, or returning home from the hospital. And every pot I carried across the street taught me something about purpose that I never expected to discover until much later in life. For many years, I believed those pots of soup and warm casseroles were simply my way of helping people through difficult days. Only after I grew older did I begin to understand that they were quietly helping me as well. Whenever a neighbor became ill, whenever a veteran returned home needing encouragement, or whenever an older friend found themselves living alone after losing a husband or wife, I almost always carried the same comforting meal to their front door. It was a slow-cooked chicken and vegetable soup with carrots, celery, onions, a little garlic, fresh parsley, and tender pieces of chicken served with a slice of homemade whole grain bread. Nothing about it was fashionable, yet people welcomed it as though I had brought them something priceless. I often stayed for a cup of tea, and before long we were talking about grandchildren, gardens, old memories, and hopes for tomorrow. Looking back, I believe those conversations nourished both of us just as much as the meal itself. That is why, when people ask what they can begin doing today, I never tell them to chase perfection. I simply invite them to look around their own kitchens with fresh eyes. Perhaps choose more meals made from familiar ingredients instead of relying on heavily processed foods. Perhaps fill half the plate with colorful vegetables whenever it feels practical. Perhaps enjoy fresh fruit as part of the day, because many people find it satisfying and refreshing. Researchers continue studying how these everyday habits may help support healthy aging, but I have always trusted what I quietly observed over decades of ordinary living. Just as important, I encourage people not to eat every meal in a hurry. Sit by a window if you live alone. Invite a friend when you can. Call a grandchild while supper is warming. Turn the meal into a peaceful pause instead of another task to complete. Throughout my life, I noticed that the happiest older people rarely spoke about strict rules. They spoke about gratitude, moderation, and consistency. They forgave themselves when life became busy, then gently returned to the habits that made them feel their best. That approach always seemed kinder and easier to live with than chasing impossible perfection. Yet if you think homemade food and simple routines are the greatest lesson I have learned in 109 years, I have one more story to share. It came from an unexpected reunion with my dear friend Margaret Hughes, and what she reminded me about honesty, compassion, patience, and living with purpose became the lesson I now treasure above every recipe I have ever written down. When I think back to the beginning of our conversation, I remember the question that stayed in my heart for so many years. Why do so many people search far from home for the secret to a long and meaningful life when so much wisdom has quietly been waiting in their own kitchens and communities? After living for 109 years, I still believe that simple question deserves an honest answer. I have prepared thousands of meals in my little home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I have watched children become parents, parents become grandparents, and neighbors become lifelong friends. Through every season of joy and every season of sorrow, one lesson returned again and again. Good food matters, but it has never been the whole story. The four humble dishes I shared with you stayed on my table because they were made with care, simple ingredients, and the hope of bringing comfort to someone else. Yet the older I became, the more I realized that another recipe had quietly been shaping my life every single day. It was the recipe of honesty, compassion, patience, forgiveness, and the desire to remain useful to other people. I truly understood this after seeing my dear friend Margaret Hughes again, so many years after we had gone our separate ways. As we talked about the people we had known, we noticed something remarkable. The men and women who seemed happiest in their later years were rarely the wealthiest or the strongest. They were the ones who forgave old hurts instead of carrying them for decades. They looked for ways to encourage others instead of comparing themselves with them. They found purpose in ordinary acts of kindness, whether it was baking bread for a neighbor, checking on someone who lived alone, or simply listening without judgment. Looking back, I believe those quiet habits gave them a reason to wake each morning with hope. If there is one small thing I wish for you after hearing my story, it is not that you copy every recipe exactly as I do. Your kitchen, your traditions, and your family are beautifully your own. I simply hope you choose one simple homemade meal to prepare with love, one old worry to gently let go of, and one kind act to offer someone before this day is over. It may not change everything overnight, but many meaningful changes begin with one peaceful decision. Thank you for spending this time with me. If my stories have brought you comfort or hope, I would be honored if you subscribe to this channel. I would love for us to continue discovering together the quiet habits, timeless traditions, and gentle lessons that have helped so many people grow older with gratitude, purpose, and joy, while making every new day feel like a precious gift.